Well, Linux sure had a bit of a moment last year, eh? With the end of 10 and forced recall shenanigans and, well, people pretty much not wanting to contribute to the end of the world by discarding possibly billions of perfectly usable computers and instead switching over to Linux. And why did Microsoft commit this unforced fumble? Oh, to make spying and selling your data infinitely easier for them. Now, I know that asking if is the year of the Linux desktop is a bit of a meme. We've been asking this from pretty much the get-go, and even posing the question is a bit of a troll at this point. But I genuinely think that this is the first year, at least in my lifetime, where asking the question is truly legitimate. At the same time, I fully recognize that I'm in a bubble of tech enthusiasts and open source advocates, and that will definitely skew my perspective. But it sure seems like more and more people are waking up to the fact that switching over to Linux is not the hassle it used to be, and that the platform has matured significantly. But based on some statistics and my personal anecdotal evidence, the best kind of evidence there is, I have personally installed Linux for a lot of my friends and family members. And you might find this hard to believe, but they've asked me, unprompted, because even though I am a Linux person here on YouTube, and granted, I do mention computing things to my friends sometimes, I'm not actually that obnoxious about it. And even me not being obnoxious, I've been asked to install Linux on older machines for them. I also asked on a couple of forums what they thought of the subject, and as opposed to some other times I asked a similar question, I didn't even get accused of trolling, which, also tells you something. But in this video, I'm gathering thoughts that I have about the subject with some input from the replies to the forum posts and comments to my previous videos. Videos you should definitely check out, or don't, I don't care. I've gathered my thoughts into two main categories. One of them are the arguments for why 2025 was the year of the Linux desktop, and the other, obviously, why it wasn't the year. So let us begin with the positives. 2025 was the year of the Linux desktop. Number one. Gaming and NVIDIA is mostly a solved issue. The biggest adopters of Linux this year seems to be the gamers out there. That makes sense, since I feel like gamers seem to be more technologically minded than your average person in general. And we are a very motivated lot to get our favorite games running on our systems exactly the way we want to. I mean, that's how I got into technology. I had a very outdated computer when I was a kid, but I didn't want that to be an obstacle to playing my favorite games. And back then, outdated meant that I had a 286 while my friends were sporting early Pentium machines. So slightly different than going from Windows 10 to Windows 11. Valve, with Steam, Proton, and funding a whole bunch of other compatibility tools behind the scenes, has essentially made gaming on Linux a solved problem. To the point that some Steam Deck players don't even realize they're running Linux with Proton as their system. And Wine with Proton and other compatibility layers even took me by surprise. When I was doing the Findy Games video for Christmas, I clicked on an executable for one of the Windows games and it just ran, even though I hadn't even set it up in any way. In fact, Proton is so very good these days that sometimes the Windows versions run better over the Proton compatibility layer, even when the very same games have the native Linux ports. In the past, I would also consult the almighty Proton DB to see if a game is compatible or not, but these days I just run a game and don't go there unless I have a problem. I genuinely don't remember the last time I had one. So gaming, aside from some exceptions, is pretty much a solved issue. And so is NVIDIA support for the most part. Back in the olden day of I want to say 2023, when I had to plonk an NVIDIA card to replace my AMD Beast for codec compatibility, I had quite a bit of issues, especially on Wayland. Now, NVIDIA has provided Linux drivers for quite a while, but since they weren't open source, the compatibility with things wasn't always assured. NVIDIA has, fortunately, finally seen the error of their ways and has joined the competitors by offering open source drivers that reached parity with the proprietary ones a while ago. And what do you know? Almost all the compatibility issues have vanished along with this change. At least I haven't noticed a performance difference. And I even had the AMD one back in the system for a while before I had to switch back to the NVIDIA one for the production of these videos. I still don't support them as a company, but at least the drivers are no longer a headache. Well, unless you have a card that's older than the GTX 1650, at which point it becomes a headache indeed. But in general, the NVIDIA support has led to Linux adoption being ever more hassle-free. Which brings us logically to number 2. Installation is easy. I kind of covered this on my video of Linux myths, a video you should go see after this one, but this year people seem to have actually grasped the fact that installing Linux is super easy. You just read what it says on the screen and click next. Of course, partitioning and stuff like that can be a pain, but most people install on a spare machine or an older laptop first, where they do want to install it on the whole disk. And, partitioning shenanigans on Windows is also a big hassle, and it does not give you anywhere near the tools that Linux does. The hardest part of the install these days is picking your distro, and that's saying a lot when it's not the install itself that I'd even worry about. Of course, there's edge cases. I actually recently made an install on one of my partner's spare machines, and the hardware was so unusual and in such weird combinations that some distros actually refused to boot at all. But these days, these are very much the exception to the rule. It kind of gave me a flashback to 2010 or so. And obviously, when I'm talking about the installation, I'm not talking things like Arch or Gen 2 here. I'm talking about regular distros with a graphical install that is the vast majority of them, even including the really nerdy approved ones like Fedora or EndeavourOS. In fact, let's install Linux right now. Okay, here we are. Let us install Pop! OS, which is Linux. First click. I chose Pop! OS pretty much at random, though I thought that, well, maybe I should try it. I haven't tried Pop! OS in ages. I haven't installed it to anything, and they usually are pretty good with NVIDIA, and I have an NVIDIA, though everybody's good with NVIDIA these days, especially modern NVIDIA, so I guess it doesn't really matter. Oh yeah, and there's also the new Cosmic Desktop, which I have tried on my Arch install, but I don't know what the experience is like out of the box. So why not test it out? Because it's built by the same team, the System 76, as Pop! OS itself. System updates are available. Well, let's not do those quite yet, please. Let's select the language, English, in my case. Yes. I would prefer the United Kingdom version of English, though interesting. What is Danish English? Let's do Danish English, because sure, why not? Let's do Finnish input and clean install. Though I hope it still puts me in a selection where, yes, this is my drive where I do all my testing. My full name is B and my username is B. I will do an appropriate and secure password, because of course I will. No, I don't encrypt. Partitioning drive. Here we go. And I always like to click this button, which, well, should tell me everything that's going on. Currently, it's not doing that, but it's also, I like to have it, I like the very Linuxy, Unixy, these info things rolling on the screen, not because I understand what's on them, but as someone who's lived with ancient versions of Windows back in the day, like DOS and all others like from back in the day, I like to know if my operating system is completely stuck and is simply not doing anything. Here you usually can see if something is happening, at least a lot better. Okay, and here we go. That was it. I have installed Linux. Let us restart the device. And that's how complicated it was. I selected a couple things and clicked next, 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 next. And here we are on the desktop. Linux. Number 3. AI actually helps new users. My takes on generative AI on average are pretty lukewarm. Here's a quick rundown. I don't like the wholesale theft of artistic works or how the AI bubble is burning the world to the ground and making computing more expensive. But at the same time, I think that the technology has had some very good uses in cases, especially when it comes to improved accessibility, machine translations, and some limited educational uses. Limited. And that's all I'm going to say as my thesis on this subject on this video. If you want to argue about this, do it in the comments. You know, it drives the engagement, but I will not participate personally. I already fought in the great AI wars on Mastodon in 2023. But one thing where many people, including me on occasion, have found it helpful is installing and troubleshooting Linux usage problems. Yes, I'd still recommend searching the web or asking on a user group first, but sometimes your specific problem can be so niche and finding a solution can be difficult. And sometimes AI can lead you down the right path. Sometimes. In fact, there was even an article on Finnish news about this elderly woman who isn't technologically minded at all, and she used AI to help her install Linux on her computer because she couldn't use Windows 11 on her machine. She obviously could have ran through a human-written tutorial as well, but the interactive nature of being able to ask questions in natural language has a massive effect on the approachability of problem solving. However, I don't recommend utilizing any AI solutions if you don't understand exactly what it does, since that can lead to all kinds of security or stability problems. What I usually do is I ask a local AI model about my problem, and then when I get an answer, I can go back and read the documentation confirming if the solution was indeed valid and if the thing that it suggested actually does the thing that I thought it does. But if your questions are on the level of, how do I access the installer? Where do I find the software installer? What is a good Linux-compatible alternative to Outlook? I don't think you're in particular danger of being hallucinated into trouble in those cases. Number 4. Adobe and rootkit DRM aren't the issue some people make it out to be. Software compatibility is a major topic in general when talking about transferring over to Linux. It even cropped up repeatedly on my video about Linux myths in the comments, where people challenge me about software availability on Linux and other open source platforms. Personally, I don't really get it because I find superior software on Linux to the closed source alternatives, but I'll grant the point that usually open source software is available for all platforms because there really is no reason not to be. So open source software is usually not the thing that will drive you necessarily to Linux. But running that software on Linux allows me more freedom in how to use it in many cases. A lot of the time when people discuss how software compatibility isn't there yet, people point out two very specific incompatibilities: Adobe Creative Cloud and games with rootkit DRM. Now, I admitted earlier that I live in a tech enthusiast bubble and therefore it skews my outlook on things. But I'd like to throw it back to some of the people highlighting this as an issue, because I think people vastly overestimate how many pieces of userland software your average person uses. Most people do not use Adobe Creative software, and most people do not play competitive online games. In fact, these days, most people use a single desktop application for everything: the browser. Maybe they use a word processor on the side. If they go hard, they may have a desktop email client. But for the silent majority of PC users who just use it day to day, there is nothing that Linux is missing. In fact, Linux alternatives are better in that they are free and without restrictions. If you retitle the shortcut to LibreOffice Writer to Word, they probably won't even notice the difference. If they are set on their ways of using Microsoft Edge as their browser, well, that's available too. Though if you switch it to Chromium, they won't notice that either. Average computer user doesn't care about software. They just want to do the thing they set out to do and be done with it. That's why these niche cases where you don't have access to a particular productivity tool aren't relevant for most people. And yes, I know, it's a bit different for work applications, of course. But most workplaces provide employees with a computer that they control, so it's a moot point. And if for you it's not a moot point, then, well, Linux is not the operating system for you. And that's cool too. My point is simply that this is not the obstacle a lot of commenters on this field think it is. Number 5. Market share probably is higher than we think. We have different metrics on operating system market shares, but the truth is that we genuinely don't have a clue. All the different metrics, be it Steam hardware survey, web stats, or various government analytics, all report vastly different numbers. And that's because it is unknowable unless we went to every computer user and asked them. The only thing we can say for sure is that Linux appears to be on a slight upwards trend and Windows to be slightly dipping, while macOS is fairly steady. But the problem with all of these is that they all trust on accurate user agent reporting, and user agents are modified on systems for various reasons all the time. A lot of the time simply to go around artificial blocks. Some websites say that they don't support a certain OS or a certain browser, but if you change how the browser reports itself, you will have full access with no problems. These days, Linux reports itself fairly often correctly, but I still get inaccurate notifications of a login from a Windows 7 or a macOS machine while I was actually on Linux. And don't even get me started on FreeBSD, because that never reports itself accurately. No wonder the market share is in the fractions of a percentage. Now, the unfortunate knock-on effect from these artificial user agent modifications is that Linux market share is artificially low, which then drives away development interest and then causes more software to be not natively supported. Do I think that accurate reporting would be a game-changing difference if we got the truly accurate numbers? Probably not, but it might help to cause a bit of some commercial development support. Some enthusiastic analysts have interpreted the data to bring Linux market share on par with macOS, which personally I don't find realistic. But the case is there, and I do think it's pretty safe to assume that the vast majority of the group known as other are likely to be Linux, as well as a sizable portion of the older Windows versions being reported. So I would find it semi-safe to assume that the upward surge that Linux has had this year is even higher than we think. And with that, and with all this positivity, we can switch over to 2025 wasn't the year of the Linux desktop. And now we get to the arguments as to why 2025 was not the year of the Linux desktop, and why perhaps we will never see such a year. In the interest of fairness, I made as many points to the list on this side as I did on the other side. But the fact that I found listing reasons for both sides of the argument, I think, tells you a lot. In previous years, finding positives would have been a struggle and negatives would be super obvious. Number 1. Getting to the installer is still a conundrum. As I covered earlier, installing Linux really is not much of a hassle anymore these days. But I must admit that I did not include one very vital and often the most challenging part of the process. And that is how to access the boot menu. Windows is especially thirsty about not showing any pre-boot options to the end user, so I venture a guess the vast majority of computer users out there don't even know that there is such a thing as UEFI on your computer, and that you can use it to select different operational settings for your machine. And the problem is that you do need to access this menu to override the default boot sequence that'll take you to whatever your pre-installed operating system is, usually Windows. And as you fellow nerds probably already know, this is not a standardized process on every machine. It is indeed this step that makes installing Linux harder than installing any other piece of software. And I'd go as far as to assume that the older woman who used AI to install Linux on her machine used AI specifically to get over this hurdle. I don't really have any good solutions to this. Some people want to make Windows bootable installers for this very reason, but I don't know if it's actually technically viable to do so. This is a conundrum that probably will continue to plague easy Linux setup for the time being. Meanwhile, for us geeks, let me tell you a trick. Instead of mashing whatever function key or system uses that you need to access UEFI, you can just hold it down. The BIOS doesn't check for a completed cycle of a button press, only if it's been pressed or not. So you can forego mashing as long as you start up the machine first. If you hold it down before it starts to boot, it might flip the press and release. Number 2. Very few pre-installed systems on the market. You know, there are a couple computer vendors out there who specialize in pre-installing Linux on their machines, but these, while becoming more numerous, are still pretty niche. The fact is that if you buy a machine from the store, it will be installed either with Windows, Mac OS, or in rare cases, Chrome OS. Defaults in computing are powerful. The vast majority of computer users never ever change any setting on their machines, so the setting they default to have a massive power on the market. We can see that in the statistics too. Windows has an overwhelming grip on the PC market, not because people chose it, but because people get it by default. People use Microsoft Edge similarly because it comes pre-installed. Well, Chrome as the dominant browser is a major exception to this rule, and it's quite amazing how they managed to pull it off. But I'm sure it helps if you have a dominant search engine that will never stop nagging you to download and install it. But when it comes to computers, people are going to use the operating system that is pre-installed with it. Most people won't even question it. Some vendors have attempted at introducing competing, cheaper versions of their products without Windows, but usually the results have been disastrous. Though the most prolific experiments happened long ago when the Linux platform clearly was not ready. These days, Lenovo and Dell offer Linux pre-installed machines for businesses, where Red Hat Enterprise Linux has gained some adoption. This seems to be a working model, but manufacturers have been reluctant to push Linux pre-builds for consumers. Maybe it's time. And, you know, it kind of is. The Steam Deck and the upcoming Steam Machine might push more Linux adoption on pre-built gaming systems, but That remains to be seen. For now, though, we are not there. Number 3. Most people don't care. Aside from all the technological issues, learning curves, and other more nerdy concerns, I'd argue that at the end of the day, the biggest hurdle in mass adoption of Linux is a sociological one. People simply do not care what operating system they run. And in an optimal world, they shouldn't have to. Unfortunately, we do not live in an optimal world. The technology sector has made quite a concerted effort to drive people into apathy about their technological choices. The issues that us technology enthusiasts highlight as big reasons to abandon Windows have been drip-fed to the masses in such a way that people are used to it. Recall spies on you? Who cares? I've shared all my life on Facebook anyway. Software is monetized by subscriptions? Who cares? I already pay for 7 different streaming services. You don't own anything you buy anymore? Who cares? Spotify made us used to renting our stuff anyway. Spyware makes it easy to steal my passwords? Who cares? I've used the same one for everything since 1996. Obviously, these are all bad things that we should be wary of and be against as consumers, but in general we just are not. We've been conditioned to accept whatever slop our corporate overlords have conditioned us to accept at prices and conditions they've set for it. And don't get me wrong, I don't blame individual users for it at all. We are all busy and we have a lot more pressing issues than software advocacy or fiddling with our operating systems. Me, and if you're watching this, you are exceptions simply because computing is our hobby. But other people have proper hobbies. They have relationships, jobs, worries and obstacles in their lives that actually have a meaning in the grass-touching real world. And worrying about your digital environment simply does not register. I mean, it should. Getting your email hacked is the best way to get your identity and money stolen, but it comes down to the numbers. I know people in my personal life who do anything and everything wrong in their data security practices, but have never had anything happen to them. I've tried to warn them and educate them on better online security practices, but as long as nothing happens, it's not going to be a concern to them. So just like people are happy reusing passwords and spreading their credit card details around all willy-nilly, they're also happy continuing with Windows. End of 10 and force-feeding AI features have been minor wake-up calls to some people, which is why we see some people move. But most people find it much, much more convenient to just ignore and forget about it. And if they're happy with Windows 10, they'll continue using it even if it's a really, really, really bad idea. Number 4. Even if higher than thought, the market share is still very low. Okay, so here's some actual numbers that I found from the various statistics sites. StatCounter 3.96% with 13% unknown. Steam Survey 3.05%. The US Government App Analytics 6%. These numbers are undeniably low. We Linux enthusiasts like to celebrate fractions of a percentage, but the fact that we have to break down the data to the second decimal tells us that we are nowhere near mass adoption. On the desktop, that is. On servers, mobile devices, and embedded systems, Linux has an overwhelming market dominance. But we're talking about desktops, obviously. And what lives on desktops? End user applications. I know I've harped on this earlier, but people don't use operating systems. They use applications. And to have Linux be a viable target for commercial application development, the market share needs to be higher. How much higher? It's hard to say. macOS has a market share of around 9% according to StatsCounter, and it gets targeted for parallel development for almost all commercial software suites. And Arguably, porting Linux binaries of software is a much simpler process than dealing with Apple's complicated walled garden. So it might be that Linux is not all that far behind when it comes to gathering development interests. But where we stand at the moment, we're just not there yet. That's why I need to run macOS alongside my Linux systems, even though I'd like to not have to. Then again, the same applies the other way around too. I couldn't get by on my macOS system alone, since I rely on a lot of Linux native tools and applications that simply are not available for Apple computers. So where is the magic threshold then? It's hard to tell, because I believe a big part of macOS support is historical and comes from designers and developers favoring Apple products. It's also where the money is, which is a big contributor. Not that Linux people aren't willing to spend money on software or hardware, though. When Humble Bundle still did their traditional bundles, Linux users were consistently the highest donators. And that leads us to number 5. Developers still avoid targeting it. Developers. Now there's a guy who knows he can afford vocal surgery. Anyway, as much as I don't particularly like this guy's evil ass, he knows that platforms are driven by software. I've already mentioned it a couple times, but it indeed is a thing that Linux sometimes lacks, especially when it comes to commercial software. There's a lot of reasons for it. Much of it has to do with how there's a lot of free and open source alternatives for solutions you need to pay on the other platforms. For example, I'm pretty sure 4K Downloader is just a wrapper for YTDLP, and most commercial media players just use FFmpeg as their backbone. There is a reason why this XKCD comic is a forever classic. But I was in the section where I was supposed to argue for it not being the year of the Linux desktop, so I'll stop harping on it. Let's just agree that a lot of proprietary and commercial software is built on free and open source tools. Now, reasons aside from market share for lacking software availability on Linux platforms are plethora. And one of the big ones is the age-old elephant in the room: fragmentation. If someone buys software, one expects it to just run. But Linux is divided into a plethora of distros that package different versions of a whole host of dependencies. And that's what makes it such a hard platform to target. I don't run Flatpaks myself on my system, but they might be a step in the right direction, especially as an option, because it gives developers better tools in managing the set dependencies. But dependencies are just one part of the fragmentation. If you target Linux, you don't know what display server the user is running, you don't know what the init system they're running, you don't know what sound system they're running, heck, you don't even know what kernel they're running. Now, I don't know enough about software development to know how much this has an effect and on which kinds of software, but I'm sure it does. A good example of this is my video editor of choice on all platforms, DaVinci Resolve. It has a Linux version and it runs great, but it sure can be a pain in the ass to install and get running. Blackmagic even took an extra effort of making their own Linux distro that is custom built to house the software, which tells you just how complicated this can get. And the kicker? I tried it. I could not get their software running on their own distro. I've had great success and good time running it on Arch, but I do need to run some housekeeping items in the dreaded terminal after every update to keep it working. Now, I've created a script to handle it in one go, but it is far from a user-friendly setup. And I don't think this is on purpose. It's just one of those things that plague Linux as a platform, and developers need to put in more development time on it to smooth over some of those issues. It's not impossible, but how many companies can justify the extra development costs? I do think the problem is solvable, much like all the other problems Linux had in the past that we no longer have to worry about. All it takes is one final step, and that can happen at any time, I think. You've probably noted from my thumbnail image that I think 2025 was Schrödinger's year of the Linux desktop. The problem with asking the question is obvious to me. We have never truly defined what the year of the Linux desktop actually would be. And that's how a lot of the responses to my threads about it confirmed, either directly or indirectly. Personally, my year of the Linux desktop was 2004, way earlier than most Linux users today. Yours might have been this past year, this ongoing year, or any year in existence since 1993. Societally, however, I think we won't be able to tell until a lot later with perspective on the shifting trends. Or the shift is so gradual that we'll never have a specific year. After all, can you tell me what was the year of the Linux server? No, seriously, I'm curious if such a thing is recognized. I don't know since I've never done server-side maintenance, but it's dominant. Was there a year, or did it just slip into dominance? But I think it's completely possible that 2025 will be recognized as the year of the Linux desktop like 10 years from now. And I also think it's possible that we'll be having identical think pieces about it then as well. Maybe I'll be making one myself. Who knows? Regardless, I hope your year will be a tolerable one. May you not be diagnosed with a terminal illness. And even if you are, join in on the conversation. And if you like my type of nerdy shenanigans, drop a sub. I'm planning to do these videos semi-regularly this upcoming year. End of promo. Ceasing production. Goodbye.